Imagine a faded envelope, sealed in black wax like a tombstone, whispering secrets from the grave. In 1936, a Virginia town dared to break it open, unleashing a storm of guilt and divine reckoning that shattered families, echoing the sins of their forefathers. What horrors lay inside? Stay, and feel the chill of Judgment Day. In the shadowed heart of Virginia's Piedmont, where the red clay earth clings to your boots like dried blood and the ancient oaks whisper judgments in the wind, lies the forgotten town of Harlow. It's the kind of place where history doesn't fade, it festers, hidden in the cracks of old foundations, in the yellowed pages of forgotten ledgers, and in the sealed envelopes that no one dares to touch. For nearly a century, one such envelope lay dormant, a silent sentinel in the damp basement of the municipal hall, its black wax seal unbroken, like the mark of Cain upon a murderer's brow. Written in the crisp autumn of 1845 by a man whose eyes had seen too much, it carried a warning etched in faded ink, not to be opened until the last soul who walked these streets in my lifetime has crossed into eternity. The town council, practical men with calloused hands and hardened hearts, chuckled at the dramatics. Superstition, they called it. The ravings of a grief-stricken eccentric. But deep down, in the quiet hours when the wind howled through the eaves, they felt a tremor, a spiritual unease, as if the letter itself was a vessel for divine retribution, holding the weight of unspoken sins that could topple the pillars of their community. 91 years it waited, patient as the grave. The world spun on, wars raged, empires fell, machines conquered the skies. But in Harlow, time moved slower, like molasses in winter, preserving the illusions of its founding families. In 1936, as the Great Depression gnawed at the nation's bones, the last survivor from that bygone era, a frail widow of 94, her skin like parchment etched with the lines of a hard life, drew her final, rattling breath. She had been born the year the letter was sealed, a child of the same soil that now claimed her. With her passing, the conditions were met. The town clerk, a bespectacled man named Elias Thorne, descended into the basement archives, his lantern casting flickering shadows on the mildewed walls. The air was thick with the scent of decay, moldy paper, rusting iron, the faint metallic tang of old ink. He found the cedar box exactly as the records described, tucked behind stacks of forgotten deeds and tax rolls. The lock clicked open with a reluctant groan, as if protesting the disturbance. Inside, the envelope lay pristine, its seal intact, the handwriting on the front sharp and accusing, like a finger pointing from beyond the tomb. They gathered on a chill Thursday afternoon in March, 7 witnesses in the dimly lit council chamber. Sunlight filtered through dust-moted windows, casting elongated shadows that danced like restless spirits. The mayor, a portly figure with sweat beading on his brow despite the cool air, nodded solemnly. Thorne's hands trembled as he broke the seal, a sharp crack echoing like thunder in the silence. The paper unfolded with a whisper, revealing pages dense with meticulous script. As they read, the room grew colder, though no window was open. Faces paled, breaths caught in throats. By Friday evening, 2 witnesses, descendants of Harlow's oldest bloodlines, had resigned their posts, their letters of abdication terse and trembling. Come Monday, feuds ignited like dry tinder, whispers in the general store turned to shouts in the streets, old alliances shattered like fragile glass. Families who had shared pews in the Baptist church for generations now averted eyes, their souls burdened by inherited guilt. By summer's end, as the cicadas screamed their relentless chorus, Harlow had hemorrhaged its essence, not its brick and mortar structures, nor its rolling fields, but the myth it had woven around itself. The narrative of hard-working pioneers, of divine favor upon a righteous community, lay in ruins. What poison dripped from those pages? A confession? A curse? Or something far more damning, a mirror reflecting the town's biblical fall from grace, echoing the words of Proverbs, "The wicked flee when no one pursues, but the righteous are bold as a lion." To grasp the letter's venom, we must journey back, not just in time, but into the soul of the man who penned it, Edmund Pharaoh. Born in 1798 under a harvest moon that bathed the farmhouse in ethereal silver light, he entered a world where the Virginia countryside was a tapestry of promise and peril. The Piedmont's red soil, fertile yet unforgiving, mirrored the human heart, capable of yielding bountiful crops or swallowing men whole in its hidden quagmires. His father, Thomas Pharaoh, was a tobacco farmer of modest stature, his 12 acres a patchwork of green leaves swaying in the breeze, their acrid scent mingling with the earthy musk of turned soil. Thomas was known for his unyielding honesty, a trait that earned him quiet respect at market days, where farmers haggled under the relentless sun, their voices rising like a chorus of bartering angels and demons. But competitors whispered of his naivety, resenting how his straightforward dealings exposed their own shadowy maneuvers. Edmund's mother, Clara, descended from Welsh stock, carried the fire of immigrants who crossed stormy seas with dreams of redemption. She instilled in her children a biblical reverence, reading from the King James by candlelight, her voice a soothing cadence that wove tales of sin and salvation into the fabric of their young minds. Edmund, the second of 4 siblings, stood apart from the start, not in outbursts of rebellion, but in a quiet, piercing observance that unnerved even his kin. As a boy, he wandered the fields at dawn, the dew soaking his trousers, noting the subtle shifts in the landscape, a fence post askew, suggesting a neighbor's encroachment, a flock of crows circling a distant copse, perhaps over carrion hidden from view. He carried a worn leather notebook, its pages filled with cryptic jottings, observations that hinted at deeper truths, like the parables of Jesus revealing hidden kingdoms. When Thomas died in 1819, felled by a sudden apoplexy while plowing under a stormy sky, thunder rumbling like God's disapproval, Edmund, at 21, inherited the farm and its burdens. The debt loomed like a specter, but he banished it in 3 years, not through toil in the fields, but through shrewd lending. His terms were fair, scripted in precise handwriting that left no room for ambiguity, yet enforceable with the cold certainty of Judgment Day. By 1825, whispers spread, Edmund Pharaoh was the man to see for a loan, his eyes deep-set and unblinking, seeming to pierce souls, discerning worthiness like a divine arbiter. He ascended the town council by 1830, drafting Harlow's charter in 1835 with the meticulous care of a scribe copying sacred texts. Yet he shunned the spotlight, preferring roles like town clerk or treasurer, positions where he could weave the invisible threads of power, debts recorded in ledgers yellowed by time, favors noted in margins, obligations etched like commandments. Edmund's life was a solitary vigil, his home a Spartan sanctuary of polished wood floors and flickering hearth fires, where shadows played on walls like ghosts of unspoken regrets. He never wed, finding companionship and observation alone, until Ruth Patten entered his orbit. Born on a neighboring farm, Ruth was the quiet counterpoint to her husband George, a boisterous merchant whose dry goods store bustled with laughter and ledger deficits. George was beloved, his generosity a balm to the community, but Ruth's sharpness cut through pretense like a blade. She and Edmund shared a bond forged in childhood church services, where hymns rose like incense, binding them in a platonic intimacy that the town gossiped about in hushed tones. Not lovers, they insisted, but confidants, sharing walks along creek beds where water murmured secrets, discussing the moral undercurrents of Harlow's affairs. Ruth saw in Edmund a kindred spirit, a watcher who perceived the spiritual rot beneath the surface prosperity. Her death in October 1843 shattered him. A fever ravaged the town that fall, claiming 11 souls like a biblical plague, the air thick with the moans of the afflicted and the acrid smoke of burning herbs. Ruth, at 44, withered in her bed, her once vibrant eyes dulled by delirium. Edmund sat vigil, his hand clasping hers, whispering prayers from Psalms, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." She slipped away at midnight, the room illuminated by a single candle's guttering flame, casting elongated shadows that seemed to mourn with him. He skipped the burial, the earth's thud on her coffin too final, too earthly. Instead, he retreated, missing council meetings for 3 weeks, a first in his punctual existence. When he returned, his demeanor was unchanged on the surface, same somber coat, same measured gait. But inwardly, a fire kindled, a quest for truth, perhaps inspired by Ruth's unspoken knowledge, or a divine calling to expose the sins that festered like hidden leaven. The next 2 years, 1844 and 1845, saw Edmund embark on a pilgrimage of discovery, his steps deliberate as a prophet's. He pored over ancient records in dimly lit archives, the dust motes dancing in shafts of light like ethereal witnesses. Not the mundane ledgers of his duties, but foundational documents, land grants from the 1790s, deeds scripted in quill ink now faded to ghostly whispers, court minutes from a time when justice was as malleable as clay. He dispatched letters to distant counties, their seals melting under candle flame, seeking corroborations. On crisp mornings, he traversed farm perimeters, his boots crunching fallen leaves, measuring boundaries with a chain that clinked like chains of bondage, comparing them to brittle maps that crackled under his fingers. When queried, he murmured of auditing property records, his voice steady, eyes averted. But this was no mere accounting, it was a spiritual excavation, unearthing the bones of Harlow's genesis. The Piedmont in the late 18th century was no idyllic Eden, it was a wilderness of ambition, where settlers fled the tidewater's watchful eyes, seeking anonymity in the rolling hills. Land grants, meant to be orderly dispensations of providence, devolved into a babel of fraud, overlapping claims, forged signatures scrawled in haste, surveys invented in smoky taverns. Courts, manned by the ambitious, turned blind eyes to theft cloaked in legality. Edmund's revelations centered on three pillar families, the Haynes, Dunning, and Correll, names etched on street signs and church plaques like false idols. The Haynes arrived in 1791 with 400 acres, swelling to thousands by 1810 through deeds that vanished sellers into oblivion. No further traces, no migrations, no deaths recorded in churchyards where weathered stones bore silent testimonies. The Dunnings mirrored this, their timber empire built on phantom transactions, the scent of pine resin masking bloodier origins. But the Corrells delved deeper into darkness, their wealth rooted in enslaved labor, records hinting at atrocities veiled in shorthand, a ledger of souls bought, broken, and buried. Edmund's breakthrough came in a rented storage room, the air stale with forgotten dust. A trunk, its lock yielding easily, revealed Harold Correll's private ledger, pages yellowed, entries cryptic yet decipherable, dates, sums, notations of dispositions. Three names emerged like specters: Samuel Oakes, whose 30 acres passed to the Haynes in 1802 via a witnessless deed, vanishing thereafter; Margaret Voss, a household servant in the Correll manor from 1800 to 1803, her fate implied in a chilling entry of final settlement; and James, a nameless claimant against the Corrells, his pursuit ending abruptly in notations of resolution by night. These were not accidents of history but deliberate erasures, murders, perhaps, shrouded in the night. Bodies consigned to unmarked graves under moonlit skies. Edmund saw biblical parallels: Cain's fratricide, the blood crying from the ground; Achan's hidden sin dooming a nation. The frauds weren't mere greed, they were pacts with darkness, tainting Harlow's soul with generational curses. In his letter, he didn't accuse wildly, he presented evidence: mismatched surveys, dead surveyors' names on living documents, ledgers cross-referenced like scriptural proofs. As he sealed the envelope in 1845, the wax dripping like tears of judgment, Edmund addressed the council with quiet finality. Laughter met his words, but his eyes held the weight of prophecy. He died in 1848, heart failure the verdict, perhaps broken by the burden of truth. Harlow buried him under a simple stone, resuming its facade. But the letter waited, a ticking judgment, until 1936 unleashed its storm. What specifics did it hold? Deeper sins, spiritual reckonings that forced the town to confront its fall. As Ecclesiastes warns, "For God shall bring every work into judgment, with every secret thing." Harlow learned this the hard way, its story forever haunted by the ghosts of 1845. The story of Harlow, Virginia, is not merely one of land and ledgers, it is a parable of concealed sin, of how a community can build its altars upon hidden graves and call the foundation holy. Edmund Pharaoh understood this better than anyone. In the autumn of 1845, alone in the lamplight of his inherited farmhouse, he sat at a scarred oak table, the same table his father had once used to tally tobacco yields. The air carried the faint sweetness of curing leaves mingled with the sharper bite of ink and melting wax. For 3 nights he wrote, pausing only to let the candle gutter and refill the lamp, each stroke of his quill deliberate, as though carving truth into stone. 7 sheets of heavy rag paper, front and back, filled with the small, unhurried hand that had once balanced the town's books. He did not accuse with fury. He did not weep upon the page. He simply laid out the evidence like a prosecutor before a silent jury of posterity. He began with the land itself, the red Piedmont earth that had fed generations yet now seemed stained. 11 deeds, all clustered between 1798 and 1813, all feeding parcels into the hands of the Haynes and Dunning families. Each bore the same fatal fingerprints: surveyors whose names appeared nowhere in the county's register of licensed practitioners, chainmen and witnesses who materialized for one transaction and vanished forever from tax rolls, church registers, militia musters. One surveyor, listed on a plat dated June 1804, had been buried 14 months earlier, his headstone still legible in the old Baptist graveyard, the dates chiseled deep. Pharaoh named the parcels: the 40-acre tract along Blackwater Creek that became the heart of Frederick Haynes's holdings, the 65 acres of timbered ridge that anchored Arthur Dunning's mill empire. He cited exact document numbers from the county courthouse, page and line, as though cross-referencing entries in the Book of Life. Then he turned to the Correll ledger, the private record he had discovered in the dusty trunk of the rented civic building. The trunk itself had yielded without resistance, its hasp rusted loose, as if it had waited decades for a conscientious hand to lift the lid. Harold Correll's shorthand was tight, almost crabbed, the abbreviations of a man who distrusted even his own ink. Pharaoh had spent months deciphering it, holding pages to candlelight, comparing strokes, until the veil parted. 3 entries stood out like wounds. Summer 1803, matter of MV resolved at Guylium property. No elaboration. Margaret Voss had last appeared in the Correll household accounts in April of that year, wages paid, linens mended, hearth swept. After that, silence. No dismissal noted, no forwarding address, no burial in the paupers section of the churchyard. The Guylium tract, 3 miles east, a tangled woodland of oak and pine, had passed into Correll ownership by 1810. By 1845 it remained theirs, undeveloped, unworked, a quiet corner of the map that no road ever touched. February 1808, J. matter advancing. Suit threatened. 4 months later, J. matter closed. No proceedings anticipated. James, only James, had evidently been a laborer or tenant pressing a claim against Harold Correll over unpaid wages or broken contract. A single unsigned draft letter in the trunk described the grievance in careful, legalistic terms. After the second entry, James vanished from every record Pharaoh could find. Samuel Oakes completed the triad. 30 acres on the western fringe, fertile bottomland along the creek. Oakes had appeared before Magistrate Daniel Haynes in November 1801 to contest a survey line that had mysteriously shifted his boundary 40 rods eastward. The magistrate, grandfather to Frederick Haynes, ruled the claim without merit. The deed transferring Oakes's land to the Haynes family was dated February 1802. No witnesses whose names surfaced elsewhere. No trace of Oakes after January of that year. No death certificate, no sale of personal effects, no sighting in neighboring counties. Simply gone. Pharaoh did not claim to possess bodies or confessions. He possessed pattern. He possessed absence where presence should have been. He possessed a ledger written in a dead man's hand that spoke of resolutions at remote properties. And he possessed the chilling overlap. Margaret Voss had served in the Correll household during the final flurry of the disputed land deals. She had almost certainly overheard arrangements, conversations in the parlor, papers signed by lamplight that were never meant for outside ears. When she gave any sign of understanding what she had heard, the ledger recorded her fate. He wrote without embellishment, yet the weight accumulated like stones upon a cairn. He acknowledged the limitations of his evidence, circumstantial, incomplete, incapable of sustaining a criminal indictment in 1845. The perpetrators were dead or dying. The victims had no living kin to claim justice. To speak openly in his lifetime, he concluded, would only destroy the messenger without redeeming the truth. The powerful families would close ranks, discredit him as a grieving eccentric, and the record would remain falsified. But to allow the lie to stand unchallenged for another generation, to let children be taught that Harlow rose through honest sweat and divine favor, was to participate in the sin. So he sealed the letter. Black wax, drip thick and deliberate, the impression of his plain brass seal sinking deep. On the outer envelope he wrote a single line in his careful hand. To be read only when every soul alive in Harlow in my time has departed this earth. Let the future judge what the past concealed. He carried the cedar box to the municipal hall at first light on a Friday morning in October. The clerk accepted it without comment, locked it away, and life resumed. Edmund returned home, brewed tea in a chipped porcelain cup, and sat by the window watching dusk settle over the town he had helped shape, the graded roads, the whitewashed church, the council chamber whose charter bore his signature. Whatever grief or satisfaction stirred in him remained locked behind those watchful eyes. Harlow moved forward, as towns do. The railroad bypassed it in 1851, routing 6 miles south through Culpeper and leaving Harlow a quiet backwater. Tobacco yields declined. Families diversified into grist mills, small tanneries, carriage works. The Civil War rolled across Virginia like a scythe, claiming sons and leaving widows, but Harlow itself escaped major battles. Its streets saw only the tramp of retreating columns and the distant thunder of cannon. The founding families endured, diminished yet persistent. The Haynes name remained affixed to pews, deeds, and civic offices. The Dunnings drifted away after the 1870s, a few returning decades later to open hardware stores. The Corrells faded fastest. Emancipation stripped their labor economy bare, younger generations scattered like seed on stony ground. Through it all, the cedar box waited. Clerks succeeded clerks. Some forgot the instructions entirely, others glanced at the envelope and returned it to darkness. In 1879 to 1893, Charles Brent opened the box, inspected the seal, noted its existence in a brief memorandum, and locked it again. No grounds for opening at present, he wrote words that would later read like a prayer unanswered. By 1910 the municipal hall had been rebuilt, the box was transferred to the county records annex, catalogued simply as Box D47, Harlow Miscellaneous late 1800s. The instruction sheet, loose inside, went unnoticed. For 20 years the letter slept among tax rolls and forgotten surveys, handled by men and women who never suspected its weight. Then, in 1931, Dorothy Stokes arrived. 40 years old, widowed, self-taught, she approached archives the way a surgeon approaches a wound, with precision, patience, and refusal to look away. Within months she located Box 47. She found the envelope. She found, wedged behind a splintered board, Edmund Pharaoh's original instruction document, its ink still sharp. She read it. She read it again. Then she began the slow, relentless work of verification. She calculated, anyone alive in Harlow before or during 1845, anyone born as late as 1844, qualified under the terms. She scoured baptismal records, census enumerations, family Bibles, letters of administration. 2 names surfaced. Elias Granger, born 1841, died December 1932 in a Fredericksburg rest home at 91. Louisa Haynes, born 1842, last of the Haynes line. She lives still in the old family house on Maple Street, a white clapboard structure whose shutters sagged like tired eyelids. At 93 in 1936 she retained a flinty clarity. When Dorothy gently inquired about old names, Louisa recalled Pharaoh as a careful man, too careful, perhaps, for his own peace. Dorothy revealed nothing of the letter. She simply waited. On February 14, 1936, Valentine's Day, though no one remarked on the irony, Louisa Haynes died. Dorothy Stokes waited 3 days out of respect, then carried the box and the instruction sheet to town clerk Walter Gibbs. "I believe it is time," she said. Gibbs, practical, unimaginative, scheduled the opening for March 12. 7 witnesses, the mayor, the circuit judge, 2 councilmen, the editor of the Harlow Courier, Dorothy herself, and Gibbs. The council chamber smelled of polished oak and old paper. Sunlight slanted through tall windows, catching dust motes in slow spirals. 8 chairs. 7 occupied. A single envelope centered on green baize. Gibbs read the chain of custody statement. The judge nodded. Then Gibbs took the letter opener and cracked the black wax. The sound, sharp, final, echoed like a gunshot in church. Inside, 7 sheets, folded once, ink faded to sepia yet perfectly legible. Gibbs read aloud for 38 minutes. For the first 10, the room held its breath. Then the mayor exhaled a low, wounded sound. After that, silence except for Gibbs's steady voice. Pharaoh's words unfolded methodically, the fraudulent surveys, the phantom witnesses, the ledger entries. He named Margaret Voss as a probable eyewitness to fraud, silenced when she understood too much. Samuel Oakes, who dared dispute a Haynes survey before a Haynes magistrate. James, whose legal claim ended in abrupt closure. He admitted the evidence was circumstantial. He explained his silence. Truth spoken in 1845 would have been buried by power, truth preserved for a future generation might at least correct the record. He closed with one sentence that cracked the room like the wax. "I have kept this town's accounts. I have drawn its boundaries. This is the final entry that was not straight." Gibbs set the pages down. No one moved. The judge spoke first. "Lord Almighty." The next morning, March 13, 1936, the Harlow Courier carried Francis Dyer's front-page account. The headline was restrained. The town was not. What followed was no mere scandal. It was a spiritual fracture, a town forced to confront that its cornerstone had been laid in blood, that its proud history was built on unmarked graves, that the divine blessing it had claimed had perhaps been a covenant broken long before. And the reckoning was only beginning. The Harlow Courier hit the doorsteps on Friday, March 13, 1936, under a sky the color of old pewter. Francis Dyer's front-page story carried no sensational headline, no murder in the founding, or blood on the deeds. Because the truth needed no exaggeration. He printed only what the 7 witnesses could swear to: the date, the place, the unbroken chain of custody, the careful reading of 7 faded sheets, the judge's involuntary gasp of "Lord Almighty." He summarized the contents as allegations of historical fraud and possible criminal conduct by certain founding families, supported by documentary evidence from the 1790s and early 1800s. At the judge's and mayor's urgent request, he withheld the specific names Haynes, Dunning, Correll, pending any legal review that might follow. But in a town of 3,000 souls, where everyone knew everyone's grandfather, withholding names was like trying to hide smoke by closing the windows. The smoke was already rising. By noon, clusters of men stood on the cracked sidewalk outside the feed store, cigarettes cupped against the March wind, voices low. "Pharaoh? The old clerk? That's the one nobody talked to much." Women lingered longer at the post office counter, glancing sideways at neighbors they had greeted warmly for decades. The question hung unspoken but palpable: if this is true, if the men who laid the first cornerstones, who funded the steeple, who named the streets, were thieves and worse, what does that make their children? What does that make us? Clara Era Haynes, 46, widowed young, great-niece and longtime caretaker of the last Louisa Haynes, received her copy of the Courier at 8:30 that morning. She unfolded it on the kitchen table, still dusted with flour from biscuits she would never finish baking that day. She read the article. Once, slowly. Then she folded the paper precisely along its creases, placed it face down beside the salt cellar, and sat motionless until the light shifted and the room grew dim. She did not cry. She did not telephone anyone. She simply remained in the house on Maple Street, curtains half drawn, listening to the tick of the grandfather clock that had belonged to her great-aunt Louisa. Saturday brought the first visitors. 3 telephone calls, polite, circuitous, each caller managing to inquire about Clara's health, the weather, the early azaleas, without once pronouncing the words letter, Pharaoh, or founding. Then came the knocks. A neighbor of 20 years arrived with a covered dish she claimed Clara Era had lent her months earlier. They sat in the parlor. The woman spoke at length about the late frost threatening the peach blossoms. She never lifted her gaze from the carpet. When she left, the dish remained on the sideboard, untouched. That night, after the town had gone quiet except for the occasional bark of a farm dog, Clara Era drove the 3 blocks to the records annex. It was closed, dark windows reflecting the moon. She had Dorothy Stokes's home address from an old Christmas card. Dorothy answered the door in a faded house dress, hair pinned for bed, surprise flickering across her face. Clara Era stood on the porch under the single bulb, coat buttoned against the chill. "Did you know?" Clara Era asked, voice level, almost conversational. Dorothy shook her head. "I knew the letter existed. I knew it contained allegations. I did not know the specifics until Walter Gibbs read it aloud." Clara Era regarded her for a long moment. "Did you consider what this would do to the families still here?" "I considered it," Dorothy answered. "I considered it every day for 5 years while I verified the chain of custody. Edmund Pharaoh spent the final years of his life making certain this document would be read when the time came. It was not my place to countermand a man who acted with such deliberate purpose." Clara's eyes never wavered. "The people he accused have been dead for 100 years. "Yes," Dorothy said softly. "But the record he was correcting is still alive." Clara Era turned without another word and drove home through empty streets. She never spoke publicly of the letter again. She issued no denials, filed no complaints, demanded no retraction. She simply withdrew into a silence so complete it became its own statement, a dignified retreat from a battlefield where the war had already been lost generations earlier. The damage spread like ink through blotting paper. Mayor George Tatum, whose family bore no direct stain but whose 8 years in office had rested on alliances with the old families, resigned the following Monday. His letter was 6 lines long, citing health concerns. Those close to him said he had not slept properly since Thursday afternoon. Dark circles ringed his eyes like bruises. Howard Pierce, one of the councilmen present at the opening, announced he would not seek re-election. At 60, after 12 years on the council, he told his daughter in a voice she never forgot, "I always knew the founding wasn't clean." Everyone half knew. But hearing the names, the dates, the exact parcels read from a document older than my father, that's different. That's the voice of the dead speaking truth. Circuit Judge Robert Enfield faced the cruelest mirror. His grandfather had served as county attorney in the 1880s, overseeing land record transitions for several of the very parcels Pharaoh had flagged. No evidence suggested the grandfather had known of the original frauds, yet the shadow lingered. Enfield stayed on the bench. Resignation would have implied personal guilt he did not carry. But in a private diary later shared with a local historian, he described the following year as the most uncomfortable of my professional life, a season of sidelong glances in the courthouse corridors, of questions asked with false casualness about old records. The Dunning family, scattered and diminished, received a courteous letter from Francis Dyer tracking them to the Shenandoah Valley. They sent no reply. The Correll name had already faded to an echo, an old house privately owned, land parceled out, no living descendant in Harlow to bear the weight. The ledger's implications, 3 disappearances, shorthand notations of resolved matters, hung over the town like fog that refused to lift. There was no one left to confront, only the fact itself, immovable, undeniable, lodged in the center of Harlow's history like a stone no one could step around. Dorothy Stokes, methodical as ever, spent the weeks after March compiling annotations. She cross-referenced every claim Pharaoh had made. The land fraud evidence held firm: false surveyors, phantom witnesses, mismatched plats, all verifiable. She located 2 additional suspect transactions Pharaoh had missed, buried in documents he never reached. The Correll ledger aligned precisely with his interpretation, though she, like he, noted its legal ambiguity. On the 3 named victims, she found no smoking gun resolution. Samuel Oakes left traces: a wife, possibly Hannah, 2 children, a contested survey dismissed by a Haines magistrate. Hannah reappeared in the 1810 census in another county, remarried, children in tow. No word of Samuel's fate. Dorothy wrote to a granddaughter in Richmond and a great-nephew in North Carolina. Neither knew of land in Harlow or any dispute. Both repeated the family story: they simply moved away around 1802 or 1803. Lost touch. The phrase echoed like a rehearsed prayer. Margaret Voss remained the most haunting. White, free, paid wages, unusual when most household labor was enslaved. She managed the Correll home with discretion that wage status perhaps ensured. Last wage entry, August 11, 1803. Then nothing: no burial, no marriage, no tax record. 1 shilling line in an 1803 letter from Harold Correll to his brother. The Voss matter has become inconvenient. I have discussed options with FH and we are agreed on the appropriate resolution. FH, Frederick Haynes's grandfather. Beside it, the ledger's matter of MV resolved at the Gilliam property. The woodland tract, 3 miles east, never developed, never searched. Dorothy considered requesting an excavation but concluded the evidence, though directional, fell short of legal threshold. James, nameless beyond a ledger entry, left almost no footprint. A labor dispute in 1807 to 1808 vanished in courthouse fire gaps. He existed only in shorthand: threat, then closure. A town's identity is fragile architecture built of repeated stories, repeated names on plaques and pews, repeated parades down the same streets. Harlow had told itself the same story since 1885, principled men wresting civilization from wilderness through virtue and toil. The letter did not declare every acre stolen or every founder a murderer. It pointed to specific frauds, specific silences, specific absences. But specificity became the crack through which doubt flooded in. If these transactions were tainted, what else in the chain of title was tainted? If 3 people vanished after crossing powerful men, how many others looked away? The questions carried no statute of limitations on conscience. No trials followed. No restitution. No public mea culpa. Instead, the town quietly amputated pieces of its own mythology. Founders' Day parade, speeches, picnic was cancelled in 1936, officially for budget reasons amid the lingering depression. Francis Dyer's July editorial gently suggested revision rather than cancellation, perhaps the occasion to tell a fuller story. The council ignored it. The 1937 event returned diminished, no historical address, no mention of the old families. The Haynes name vanished from new plaques. Dunning Road became Ridgerist Avenue in 1941 quietly, during routine signage replacement. These were small erasures, almost invisible. Yet to those who noticed, they signaled a profound shift. The town could not resurrect the lost or punish the dead, but it could cease to honor their inheritors. It could stop turning anniversaries into celebrations of theft disguised as providence. Dorothy Stokes spent years building an archive: Pharaoh's letter, her annotations, related documents, descendant correspondence. She filed it meticulously, wrote a clear finding aid, and left it available. She retired in 1954 after 23 years. At the ceremony, clock, certificate, polite speech praising her thoroughness, no one mentioned the cedar box. She replied simply, "The work of an archivist is to keep the truth of the past available to the present. I am glad to have done it." The sentence landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. No applause. No protest. Just ripples spreading outward, carrying the weight of things too true to cheer. In the end, Harlow did not collapse. Buildings stood. Fields were plowed. Children were born. But something essential had fractured: a certainty, a shared story, a spiritual ease with its own history. The letter did not destroy the town. It forced the town to live with the truth it had inherited, that some foundations are laid in shadow, and once the light falls upon them, the shadow never quite leaves. James exists now only because chance and conscience aligned across generations. 2 terse entries in a dead man's private ledger, shorthand scrawled in haste, locked in a trunk whose key had long rusted away. If Edmund Pharaoh had not lifted that lid in the summer of 1844, if Dorothy Stokes had not pried open the cedar box in 1931, if a young clerk named Percy Howell had not paused before tampering with an envelope that looked too official, James would have dissolved entirely. No birth, no claim, no end. Just a single initial in a murderer's notation, reduced to cipher. Pharaoh understood this erasure better than anyone. Near the close of his letter, he wrote words that cut deeper than accusation. The gravest danger is not the fraud, nor even the violence that may have followed. The gravest danger is how simply a human life can be removed, not from the earth, but from memory. One false deed, one compliant magistrate, one sealed trunk, and those who labored here, who dared ask for what was theirs, ceased to have existed. Harlow was founded on the belief that its builders deserved remembrance. I ask only that we extend that same courtesy with honesty. He did not rage. He stated fact, the way a ledger states debit and credit. And in that restraint lay the letter's chilling power. It forced the reader to supply the moral horror themselves. Before we reach the end, consider this: was Edmund Pharaoh right to seal the letter rather than speak it aloud in 1845? Or did those 91 years of silence inflict a wound deeper than any immediate scandal could have? Drop your thoughts below. Subscribe and ring the bell. We're nearing the close, and the final revelation is not what you expect. There is one thread left, one final piece that transforms the letter from mere historical correction into something profoundly personal, almost sacramental. It concerns Ruth Patton. Ruth died in October 1843, fever claiming her at 44. Edmund sat at her bedside through the long hours, holding her hand as she slipped away under the flicker of a single candle. He did not attend the burial. He retreated to his farmhouse for 3 weeks, the first absence in his punctual life. When he emerged, he began the slow, methodical descent into the town's oldest records, not as clerk or treasurer, but as a man compelled by something deeper than duty. Dorothy Stokes, ever the archivist, pursued this question with the same precision she brought to every other. In the Virginia State Historical Society's collections, donated family papers from a Richmond cousin, she found a letter dated December 1843, 2 months after Ruth's death. Edmund wrote to his cousin of farm matters, finances, the cousin's children. Then, near the end, a single paragraph that Dorothy transcribed in full in her supplementary notes. I find myself returning these past weeks to a conversation I had with Ruth some years ago, the details of which I never fully committed to paper, believing at the time she was perhaps exaggerating, or that the matter was too long settled to pursue. She spoke to me of something concerning the Carell household and a woman who served there in her mother's day. Ruth's mother knew this woman slightly. Ruth carried the knowledge forward without knowing what use to make of it. I did not give her words the weight they deserved while she lived. I mean now to make that right. Ruth had known, perhaps not the full horror, but enough. A whisper passed from her mother about Margaret Voss, about the Carell house, about something inconvenient that ended in silence. Ruth had confided in Edmund, the one man in Harlow whose ear might have listened. He had not acted. He had been too careful, too embedded in the town's quiet machinery of favor and debt, too willing to let inconvenient truths remain unspoken. Then Ruth died, carrying the burden he had failed to share. The sealed letter was not born of abstract principle alone. It was penance. A debt paid too late to the woman who had trusted him with a fragment of darkness. Edmund had spent 30 years watching Harlow without truly seeing its underbelly. Ruth's death stripped away that comfortable blindness. The letter became his belated act of fidelity to her memory, to the truth she had carried, to the moral accounting he had neglected in life. Dorothy Stokes wrote of him plainly, Edmund Pharaoh was no hero. He was a man who learned too late, who carried too much, and who did what he could in the time remaining. The letter was his attempt to repair what he had failed to prevent. Whether it was enough is not for us to judge. Perhaps enough and not enough can coexist. The full text appeared in the Harlow Courier on April 3, 1936, 3 weeks after the opening, delayed by hushed discussions about responsibility. Mayor Tatum had resigned, Judge Enfield declined to press further suppression. Francis Dyer, sensing the moment, published. The run of 800 copies vanished before noon. A second printing was rushed. Strangers subscribed. The words, precise, unadorned, devastating, were read aloud in barbershops, kitchens, on sagging porches. Conversations followed that Harlow had never permitted before, direct, historical, unresolved. Anger flared in different directions. Some cursed Pharaoh for waiting, for letting generations grow up on a polished lie. Some blamed the clerks who had guarded the box without curiosity. Some turned on the families, not the living descendants, most innocent of direct sin, but the institution of their names, the way those names had functioned for a century as silent endorsements of a falsified past. Denial surfaced briefly. A week later, 7 residents signed a letter to the Courier calling Pharaoh eccentric, his evidence circumstantial, publication irresponsible. Dyer printed it, then responded in an editorial. The cited documents were public, Dorothy Stokes had verified the frauds in full, legality and truth were not the same question. The denials dwindled, not from conversion, but from the sheer weight of specifics, dead surveyors, phantom witnesses, ledger notations too exact to wave away. What Harlow did was slower, subtler, more enduring. The Historical Society withdrew its old pamphlet on the founding families in 1937. Over 2 years they produced a new one, measured, factual. It included sections on Pharaoh and the letter, on the fraudulent surveys, on the 3 disappearances. It used disappearance, not murder, following Dorothy's counsel, certainty without proof invites dismissal. The pamphlet sat in the library, the annex, the county collection, quietly present, quietly accurate. The first official acknowledgement that Harlow's origin story had shadows. Clara Era Haynes read it. By then 50, she had withdrawn, not fled, but receded. She kept the house on Maple Street, attended church, but declined vestry seats, civic invitations. She became ordinary. In the early 1950s, a University of Virginia historian researching antebellum land fraud visited the archive. He spent 3 days with the Pharaoh collection. On the last, he met Clara Era briefly. She had no family documents to add or contradict. Asked if she believed the letter accurate, she paused. I believe Edmund Pharaoh was not a man who invented things. The historian noted it in a 1956 footnote. For the full account, see Harlow Municipal Archive, Pharaoh Collection, Box 1. Towns do not shatter when confronted with truth. They absorb, adjust, carry unaltered. By the 1940s, the first shock had settled into a new awareness, a quiet unease with the past. Children born after 1936 knew of the letter vaguely, like a geographical fact, present, unchangeable, seldom examined. The Gilliam property, where the ledger claimed Margaret Voss's matter was resolved, was cleared in 1948 for post-war homes. Roads sliced the woodland, families moved in, ignorant of what lay beneath. Dorothy, retired, read of it in the Courier. She added a marginal note to her document: the Gilliam property was developed in 1948. Whatever lay there is now inaccessible. Margaret Voss's fate remains unanswered. She died in 1961 at 70. Her papers, including a compact notebook of unanswered questions, went to the archive. The final entry, from the 1950s, 30 years with Edmund Pharaoh's account. I believe he was right in nearly everything. Right to seal when he did. Right that the record must not remain false. Less certain it helped those it was meant for. Certainty on that was never promised. The Pharaoh collection endures in the Harlow Municipal Archive. Original letter, cedar box, annotations, correspondence. Consulted by historians, genealogists, the occasional resident. In 1978, a middle school teacher, Harold Brandt, built a unit around it, age-appropriate, unflinching, about how communities shape and distort memory. He taught it 12 years. Students later credited it with sparking their interest in history. Haynes Lane still bears the name, no proposal to change it gathered force. Edmund's house vanished long ago, replaced twice over. No marker stands. His monument is quieter, accuracy in the record, names restored where none had been. Samuel Oakes, Margaret Voss, James, they have no graves we can visit, no monuments. But their names now stand in the archive beside those who erased them. A small, stubborn correction: these people were here. They lived, worked, suffered, vanished. This is what an honest account requires. Edmund understood this would be the limit of his letter's power: no reversal of injustice, no resurrection of the lost. He wrote it anyway. Thursday evening, October 1845, autumn dusk pressing against the window, Ruth 4 weeks in the ground, the weight too specific to forget. He sealed it in black wax. He delivered it. The town carried on, unaware that in its basement waited the true ledger, patient, inexorable. In March 1936, Walter Gibbs broke that seal. Harlow regretted it, not because the truth exceeded imagination, but because naming the nameless brings its own grief. Samuel Oakes, 30 acres stolen, then gone. Margaret Voss, trusted with dangerous knowledge, then erased. James, seeking justice through lawful means, then closed. These names are in the record now. Small. Permanent. Exact. Not justice. Not monuments. Just presence where absence once reigned. Edmund spent his life keeping Harlow's accounts. In the end, the most vital entry was the one he left for strangers yet unborn, in a town that would spend decades learning not quite to meet his gaze. If you are the future he addressed, he succeeded. What do you think? Was the truth worth the cost? Was it revealed fully, or does some shadow still linger? Share below. If this moved you, pass it to someone who seeks the hidden chapters of our past. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and tell us, where in the world are you hearing this?